what constitutes the as far as practicable?
Well, all the banks were not in the same circumstances when they were shut down. And I'm aware that there are some criminal prosecutions with misuse of funds and so on and so forth. And that's why I don't want to treat it uniformly. And I said, as far as practicable, those that were unjustly withdrawn, can be restored.
And once you talk about those that were unjustly withdrawn, I get the impression you have a fair idea those that can be restored.
Yeah, definitely. I'll give you an example. I said one bank was shut down because there was criminal prosecution against its major shareholder. It had nothing to do with the bank. And there might be other such cases. And so we need to look at all of them and see whether the withdrawal was just or it wasn't. And the point even is, if you wanted to apply the current reserve position with this debt exchange, are you going to shut down the existing banks? The existing banks have been weakened by this debt exchange. If you apply that same principle, you apply to the indigenous banks, you probably will withdraw the licenses of some existing banks. But government is willing to assist to build those banks back. And the question I ask was, why could we not have done the same with indigenous investments in our banking sector? Today, most of those banks belong to Ghanaians. And today, the banks that are wholly owned by Ghanaians in the financial sector are few. Most of the banks are the big multinational foreign banks. And you don't even need banks to be of the same capitalization because they address different segments of the market. You don't want everybody to be a 400 million Ghana cedi bank that makes big credits to big business. You have small traders who rely on banks like Undum's Bank, GN Bank. I've traveled around this country. Every single district you go, every single community you go, you see that small brick and tile GN Bank. And it was accepting deposits of 50 cedis, 100 cedis, and so on and so forth. And that created a network for private credit to the lowest of the low in our countries, in the rural areas. And so we should have thought through this properly. And that's why I said, why turn a 4 billion problem into a 25 billion problem? We could have used far less money to turn those banks around. Government could have done like has been done in other places, where you give the support that the bank needs to turn around, take a part of the equity. And as the bank builds back, it takes back its equity by paying the support that you give. It's been done in many countries. Why couldn't we do the same here?
Okay. So, in moving away from this one, so for that one that you made reference to, for instance, we can reasonably infer it's one of those that you look at and one of those that would meet your as far as practicable condition.
Well, we've not done an analysis of them yet, but okay. I'm saying that as far as practicable, if the withdrawal of the licenses is deemed to be unjust, we would look at restoring it.
Great. You also talked about creating a conducive environment for business. It's one of the things we talk about most of the time. And what I want to find out from you is what for you constitutes a conducive environment for business, and giving the chance, how you would want us to create that conducive environment.
We are in competition in our sub-region for investment, both domestic and foreign. And so we must create the environment that allows businesses to thrive and grow. And one of the first basic things will be to have a stable economy. This yo-yo economy that we have, boom and bust, is not good for business. And so the last time we went into an IMF program, I said this must be the last time we go. We must manage our economy prudently so that it's predictable. It creates an environment where businesses are not surprised by new government policy in terms of taxes and so on and so forth, by deterioration in the value of the currency and all that. Unfortunately, we grew 8-point-something%. We had done all the heavy lifting in 2015 and 2016. Of course, we did a 3-year program because we wanted to send a signal that our economic rehabilitation recovery program could transcend political regimes. And that's why we agreed for the 3rd year. That came in 2017. And so it was this government that came and completed the 3rd year. And so there was still some discipline in the 3rd year because we were still in an IMF program. As soon as the program ended, Kenke Party, and then we started mismanaging our own affairs. Of course, Nkrumah said we should be able to mismanage our own affairs. And we started mismanaging our affairs, and today we're where we are. The red flag was raised about excessive borrowing, and nobody will listen. They said, oh, well, we're getting that money because we are credit worthy and the international market trusts us. Today, that same international market has shut you out. And so that's why I'm trying to give some positive solutions. For instance, I made the remark just now that we should review the Public Financial Management Act to include capping the rates of debt accumulation. And so we can say that, look, we cannot do more than 65% debt to GDP.
Okay.
And so if a government is, surpassing the 65% debt to GDP, it has to hold the brakes. We must reduce non-concessional lending. And we did it in 2015. In agreement with the IMF, we agreed that we will not borrow more than $500 million non-concessional finance. Every other finance will be grants and concessional financing. And with that, we were able to manage our debts. We left end of 2016 with a debt to GDP ratio of 56%. Today, we're in excess of 100%. And so legislation to cap how much government accumulates in debt will become necessary so that tomorrow another government doesn't come when we have achieved stability and goes on a borrowing spree and creates the same kind of problem that we have. So a conducive environment for the private sector is to have stability and predictability in the economic management, that the CD is going to remain relatively stable. Even if it deteriorates, it will deteriorate at a gradual rate every year, instead of bump from 6 to 13 CDs to a dollar. And I mean, if inflation goes up from 15 or 16% to almost 54%, these are the things that affect businesses and either make investors fold up and go away, or some of them, move out to our neighboring countries.
Great. So you talk about, creating jobs. I mean, one of the things that I'm sure a lot of, businesses will be excited about. But you also talk about a little bit of digression. That's the IMF and everything you've talked about. Well, that's become our story recently. Lots of the conditionalities that you said, well, we got to realize after the approval, actually talks about government limiting wage increase and employment, for instance. So a lot of these jobs that you're talking about, that if you are given the chance in 2025 you're going to create, how do you intend to go about it?
Yeah, so like I was saying, we should, before we went into an IMF program, have put our house in order. And that's what we did successfully in 2015. You remember we had the Century Forum?
Yes.
We did it to come out with a homegrown fiscal consolidation policy. We invited industry, we invited academia, civil society, political parties, everybody. It's only the MPP that refused to come. And they said any of their members who come, they were going to sanction him. So Osafo Mafu had agreed to come. At the last minute, he pulled out because his party said they'll sanction him. The only brave MPP person who came was Kwame Pianim, and I respect him up till this day. But we had a wonderful conversation. PV Obeng of blessed memory and a small team were made to synthesize the whole Century Forum discussion. And so they came with the Century Report. And the Century Report became our homegrown fiscal consolidation policy. So at the time I took the decision, in consultation with our economic management team, to go to the IMF, we had our document ready. We knew what we wanted to do ourselves. Indeed, we had started to implement it in the budget of that year. Just that for policy credibility, the international community didn't believe that we could maintain that discipline in terms of, implementing the homegrown fiscal consolidation policy. So the EU and everybody was still withholding their grants and all that, even though we're factoring it in the budget. And that is what was creating a bigger deficit, because you factor it in the budget and they don't release the money. And so it creates a deficit in the budget. Then the next year you factor it in again, they don't release the money. So we said, okay, I think they just want IMF as a headmaster to come and stand over us and mark our script and all that. So we said, okay, we'll go to the IMF. And so we did. And when we went to the IMF, we went with our program. The country had seen it, we had published it, we had announced it in the budget, and we had a lot of the things that the IMF agreed, we had put in there ourselves. For instance, in the public sector, we said that we're going to import a net freeze on recruitment. What a net freeze means, and indeed our political opponents hit us with a gudgel on the head because of that, was that if 30,000 people were retiring from the public services this year, we will employ 30,000 people to replace them. The only sectors that were exempt were education and health, where we're going to employ based on the needs and capacities in the sector. But every other public sector was going to be a net freeze. Now I've seen the parts of the agreement. It says 0.5% increase in the public sector. So there's going to be a restriction in how much government can employ in the public sector. And so the unbridled recruitment of people day in and day out is going to be constrained for the next 3 years. And that is what brings the private sector in.
Okay.
Because if there's going to be employment and recruitment, it's the private sector that must absorb them. But I mean, if you look at the difficulty the private sector is going through itself, in terms of the new taxes we've imposed, high utility bills, it's also going to constrict their ability to be able to absorb the excess, labor that is in the market. And so that is what we need to put our minds to. And that is the conversation I'm asking that government should have. And government should have had before going into the IMF.
Any special policies you propose around this time to enable the private sector to absorb these persons?
Well, there's a time we should have been given tax breaks to stimulate private sector, but we're rather increasing the burden of taxes on the private sector. And that's why I was asking, what happened to the famous taxation to production mantra that was touted that never happened? Today they're paying more taxes than they've ever paid in their history. But I do think that if the economy stabilizes too, it will improve the business environment. It will bring back some of the investors who have left, some of those who have left to neighboring countries. We should be able to attract them. We should go out of our way on investment drives to bring some of the labor-intensive, light manufacturing jobs to Ghana. As I think it was the IFC man said, in Asia and other places, population is becoming an issue. Labor issues are going to come because they are having fewer children. And the part is they are growing their economies to the higher end of production. And so there's a certain vacuum there for producing leather goods, for producing clothing and things that Bangladesh and Vietnam and all were very interested in. Even in the agribusiness space, like he said, there's a limit. They've reached the limit of growing rice because the paddies are finite. And so where is the next place for growing rice to feed the rest of the world? It's Africa. Africa still has more than 50% of the world's arable lands. So those are areas that we can begin to look to. Malaysia came and took the palm fruit from here. Today we import palm oil and vegetable cooking oil from Malaysia. Meanwhile, we have huge lands. Because of our land tenure system, it is not possible to acquire them to get investors to come and grow oil palm so that we can feed our own industry. Here we're importing hundreds of thousands of tons of palm oil to feed Wilmar and our vegetable oil processing companies here. How can we utilize those lands and interest these captains of industry to look at agribusiness and agricultural production to what incentives can we give? And that's why I say a dialogue and a conversation is important. We want to talk to Wilmar, we want to talk to Olam, we want to talk to all these who have the technology and capacity to do it. They've done it in other countries. What incentives do they want government to give them? Okay. In order that they help us with cotton production in the north, that will bring extra incomes to poor northern families. How do they help us to grow the palm oil that they use for their industry? These are all things that we can have a conversation about.
Finally, you haven't talked about those taxes. Is it my understanding that if given the chance, you would reverse these taxes or you actually scrap them? Or you would reduce them? What would you do?
Well, you're not going to be able to do it as long as you remain in the IMF program. Once they sign on the dotted line and commit to those taxes, a new government that comes in 2025 is not going to be able to renege on those taxes. But it's a 3-year program from what I understand. So 1.5 years of that program is going to be part of the term of this government. And then it means that in the term of a new government, 1.5 years of that term would also be under the IMF. And so whatever they've appended their signature to is going to affect, a new government that comes in. It's only after 1.5 years, when Ghana has graduated out, that you can look at those taxes and gain and say, look, we can give some relief to the industry in this regard, because our revenues are doing better, production is picking up, the economy is more stable. And so these are things that you can review, after the program has ended. But for now, we've locked ourselves in.
Well, our time is also up. Thank you very, very much, Mr. John Dramani Mahama.